What is a loading pin? It's a relatively simple thing for weightlifting. You load it up with weight, and then you clip it to a machine, and you lift the weight. It's a reasonably simple engineering challenge, but the problem becomes a little more complicated if you don't weld. A typical design on the interwebs is to use something like this, one of these plates and a nipple. This is nice enough, but a couple of problems. The mounting plate, those are typically expensive, and then you still have to put some kind of end cap here that is threaded to one of these, and it's just too much of a hassle to load and unload. I think I can do a little bit better. I'm a little bit ashamed to admit that I can't weld. If I could, I would do something like this and something like this, and then the problem would be solved. Not entirely in this case, because this little hole still wouldn't slip over that, and I want it to be easy loading like this one is. Notice the weight fits right over the hook, and then it easily attaches. A metal plate is also harsh when it hits the ground, so I also want to incorporate something from this design, which is a big, thick felt pad, which makes it nice and quiet as it lands. And so, my plan so far is to use this piece of black iron, 1 inch inside diameter, which fits almost perfectly through most standard weights. And what my plan is to bang this into something like this, and then to put a shear pin at the bottom to keep the load in place. So, I expect this to be a little bit labor intensive, but reasonably inexpensive. And thankfully, there will be no welding involved. We'll get started at the anvil. Do you see the split? I could probably get away with it, but how about I cut it off, try again, and use some heat. This started as 16 inches, but I think I can make it 12. Apologies, sometimes it's just not worth filming everything, especially for a niche video like this that's not likely to exceed a few thousand views. But what I can do, instead of showing you the whole painstaking project, is show you how it progressed instead. Here's how the top turned out. You can slide the weight over it and clip right in. Should be strong enough for the amount of weight that I can lift. So you'll have to find your tightest weight, and then you can use it as a go, no-go gauge. If it gets jammed on somewhere, it will mar your finish and you'll still need to grind or file some down. But back to how I did this, I started the same way that I did earlier, except I used a smaller hammer. And I did apply a little bit of heat. I just stuck it in the wood burner for a while. I didn't turn it red hot. Return to this split for a moment. You may or may not find this interesting, but if you follow the split along this marker line and you look at the other side, it appears as though there's a seam there. I didn't think black pipe was supposed to have a seam, but it sure seems as though this did. And so what I did was I put the apparent seam, I followed it down and put it along where one of these splits would be. So I pounded it flat and then used a grinder to take some of this width away so that it would fit into the hole. I'm no expert, but it sure looks like that's a seam to me. Tools that are exceptionally helpful for shaping this way. Obviously a hammer, but be gentle, don't go too fast unless you have the metal red hot, which I wasn't willing to do because it makes it harder to work. An angle grinder can help you make these cuts, and drill at first with something small and then use a progressively larger bit until you get all the way up to the width that you're after. In my case, it was 3/8 of an inch, but then I used a little round file to further open the hole. And then the last step is to use a sander. In my case, I used a disc sander and just twisted it around, knocking away all the high spots. and then finally I wire brushed it. Don't underestimate what you can do to a piece of mild steel with a few files and some sanding. Next up, how do we keep the weight from falling off the bottom? If your piece of pipe has a threaded end on it, then you can use an end cap or a coupler or something, and you're done. But since mine does not, I have to go about it a different way.
After some deliberation, I decided to drill perpendicular to that seam. Whenever you're drilling metal, try to keep sharp drill bits, which is tough. I use mineral oil as a cutting fluid, and I use graduating sizes of drill bits to work my way up until I get the size that I'm after. The real trick to drilling metal, though, is to find the correct balance between pressure and speed. It's an art. The finishing touch here is to keep the pin from moving out of its position, and we can do that using a center punch, which in this case is just an old nail set that's been sharpened to a point.
There, the pin is in place, and the weight can no longer push through. But we're not done yet. Why? Because although this pin can easily support a load of twice my body weight, it's really not designed for that sort of impact. You could, in theory, shear it off. So let's fix that with a used rotor. With the rotor in place, now when we load weight, the weight rests on the rotor itself and the loading pin is free. That way, if the weight were to be dropped when it hits the ground, instead of the pin itself underneath taking the heavy load and getting sheared off, instead it'll hit the rotor and stop. A rotor like this can easily be found at your local mechanic. He or she will probably give you one for absolutely nothing. They're usually door stops and scrap metal. This one weighs 20 pounds, so a rotor is also a great way to save money on weights. You might not be done thinking about this yet, so take a look at it from underneath. Next thing we want to do is keep this in place, and that's easy enough with a wooden circle. This piece of felt will act as a gasket between this piece of metal and the rotor. And the reason for that is because after the weight relaxes on the ground, it disengages, but then when you pick it back up, it would otherwise make a metallic sound every time.
This is not the first time I've used this handy trick. The secret to it is to be sure to keep the piece of metal nice and warm. If they're both hot, it irons very quickly. The last one had a felt bumper on its bottom that was made out of 6 layers or so, but on this one I used something like 7 or 8. The more, the better, because craft felt isn't too expensive. My approach here is to just use up as many scrap pieces as I can. There's no reason for them to be solid pieces as long as you use enough spray glue. But the top and bottom layers were one piece. When the glue starts to gunk up your shears, you can clean them off with a little bit of WD-40. Then the cutting goes much smoother. The WD-40 isn't a solvent for the glue, but it will wipe the stuff away.
Craft felt is made by being compressed, so it's going to be very resistant to having weight dropped on it continuously. Not bad.
The pull-down machine being used here is too complicated for me to show you how to make it in just this video. So it will have to be the subject of a different video some other day in the future. In the meantime, if you check out on the left of the screen those push-up bars, or in the top left of the screen there's some rings. I have videos about those. So I will add links to the end of this video to take you to those.